Doug Peterson, Carson Wentz. They all spoke. John McMullen was there, 97.3 ESPN.com. At JF McMullen on Twitter. Check him out there. I think the conversation's interesting regarding Prescott, who did not play last night. We'll get into that we were having last hour with John and more, as Doug Peterson today kind of vague on next Thursday night whether Carson Wentz would play or not. It seems like, John, the new trend around the league is the first game. You used to get like a series. It seems that teams aren't even doing that anymore. So do you anticipate seeing Carson and Jeffrey and many of the starters Thursday night?
I couldn't imagine seeing Alshon Jeffrey specifically. A few of the starters will have to play. And probably, actually, I take that back. They don't have to play with in that first preseason game. And you're right. I mean, that's the way the NFL is going. You saw it last night in the Hall of Fame game. Now, granted, those teams have 5 games instead of 4, but and no Dak Prescott, obviously, Ezekiel Elliott, Des Bryant. From Arizona's standpoint, no Carson Palmer, Larry Fitzgerald, David Johnson. You don't play your good players in the preseason basically at all till week 3, and then you give them a little taste of it, and then you shut them down again for week 4. It's about being healthy for the regular season, and Doug kind of admitted that when it came to Alshon Jeffrey. He said, basically, I've seen enough. I'm just trying to get him to week 1 healthy.
That's interesting because it almost suggests now that the teams think that the training camp is it's too, like, they're admitting that it's too long, right?
Well, I don't think they're admitting that it's too long. I think they're admitting that the current system isn't that valuable because they cut it back to the point, obviously no more two-a-days. You're drastically limited padded practices from the collective bargaining agreement. So I think they're saying under this system, it's better to just shut everything down and keep everybody healthy than it was to sort of get better under the old system where you could really get repetitions. And to be honest, the product was better back then. And that's because people actually got to practice, and it's common sense to say repetition makes you better. But I think coaches have realized, look, there's just not enough time to do what you want to do, so you might as well keep your key people healthy and do everything possible. So I think they've shifted the mentality a little bit.
Yeah, we'll see what happens next week. Of course, the Eagles open up the preseason on Thursday night against the Green Bay Packers, and a lot of questions leading into that. Let's go a little bit back to the other day. They signed Corey Graham. We kind of glazed over that yesterday because didn't have a lot of information on what the Eagles' plans were for him, but today Doug Peterson was asked about Graham, who hasn't played corner in, 3 seasons, has been a safety. And typically when you go from corner to safety, that suggests that someone thought you lost a step. So someone thought he lost a step 3 years ago. Do they envision him at corner or safety?
Well, he said they're going to start him off at safety, and we'll see how it develops as he gets here and starts practicing. I think it's an indication that they're desperate. They're desperate to add talent in the secondary, and I think ultimately he's going to end up as sort of a hybrid player. I mean, on paper, obviously, they don't need nearly as much help at safety as they do at cornerback. And you're right, he hasn't played cornerback in 3 years. He's 32 years old, but he was a capable cornerback when he did play that position. Even made the Pro Bowl 1 year. And understands how to play the game. So in some sense, I think it's just throwing the dart at the dartboard and hoping it's better than what you have.
Right.
We always talk about when the rosters are filled, there's not a lot of guys on the street. And if they are on the street, there's a reason. And Corey is a guy who's obviously past the age of 30. And people have concerns at sort of a thoroughbred position that you're going to lose it from a skill set standpoint. That's why he was on the street. But the Eagles need help. So I think it's sort of why not roll the dice.
No question. And I guess they need help at backup safety, too. So the worst scenario is even if he can't play corner, they could look at him as a backup safety, although you said Terrence Brooks has really separated himself. I don't know that he separated himself so much that they would feel comfortable playing him every down.
No, I don't think they would. I think it's more of a speaking of the starters, which Jim always lauds Malcolm Jenkins and Rodney McLeod, and obviously if you get injured from there, Terrence Brooks would probably be the third safety over Jalen Watkins before they brought in Corey Graham, but now he'll have competition, and maybe it's as simple as that, and they do want to improve the backup safety position. That's always a possibility. And maybe they'll address cornerback again as we get closer via trade or waiver wire pickup after the 90-man cut down to 53. So this could just be an attempt to improve the depth at safety. But the fact that he has played cornerback and they have such issues there, it almost makes you think they have to try it at some point to give him at least a look in practice at cornerback.
Right. John McMullen's with us, 97.3 ESPN.com. I remember going back to the draft, you talking about Kyle Fuller as a guy. He's in the same draft class as Matthews. Do you think that they are considering or having conversation like, hey, do you guys trust this Aguilar enough that we can make phone calls about Jordan Matthews?
You know, that's interesting because I brought up the Jordan Matthews part before. It's pretty clear. I mean, the Eagles have a history with Howie Roseman in charge that if they believe in you and they think you're going to be a core player of this organization, they're going to extend you early. And they haven't done that with Jordan Matthews. And he understands it. So that kind of tells you they don't think he's going to be here past this year. And if that's the mentality, well, why not trade him if you could spin him off and get something that you need, as in a cornerback? And the fact that Nelson Aguilar has played a lot better, that gives you at least a little bit more comfort in saying maybe this guy's ready to step in and be in that type of spot. But you got to be cautious with Nelson Aguilar. Every day he's basically been impressive, so I laud him for that. But it's different when you're on the field. And the guy we've seen on the field for 2 consecutive seasons has been really bad. So I don't think you can just assume because he's played well in practice that's going to carry over. You sort of have to, as I said, you have to be cautious. You have to wait. And I would be very, very hesitant to trade Jordan Matthews unless you can get something really, really significant back.
Yeah, that is the big thing. Is like you like what you currently have, but you obviously have to give to get. And it's, do you trust the Matt Collins or the Nelson Aguilar or somebody else to replace Jordan Matthews, who right now went from, I equated it to, when you have a kid that, he plays second base, but you got 4 other guys that all they can do is play second base. So you got to tell your best second baseman that I got to move you someplace else because I trust you more than I trust these guys. Matthews is the best slot guy, but last year they trusted him more than they trusted anybody else, so they kind of had to take him out of his comfort zone. You know what I mean? So now you move him back to his comfort zone, he becomes one of the premier guys as the number 3 as opposed to what he was last year.
Yeah, I agree. He's a very good slot receiver. He really is, and he's been really a productive player. There's no other way to look at it. I agree with you. He was miscast, certainly miscast as a number 1 receiver. You might even argue in certainly the lower level of number 2s in this league. But as a number 3, all of a sudden, that's really, really good. The problem is, when you start talking Matt Collins, for instance, he's not ready. He's just not ready to play this season. That's not to say he won't develop down the line, but there's no way you're going to trade Jordan Matthews and think he could be in the mix to be one of the main receivers on this team. It's just he's not developed enough. He's got a long way to go. Same thing with Sheldon Gibson. Same thing even with Marcus Johnson, who's been the best receiver of those three in camp and is probably further along, you have to be very cautious giving up a guy who's produced the way Jordan Matthews has produced. So we can point out all the flaws, and there are some, but the guy has been a very productive player.
Yeah, he had no doubt. I mean, you want to keep Jordan Matthews around, but if somebody called them and there was a starting caliber corner, they have to listen, right? I mean, are they doing a disservice to this team if they don't listen?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, you have to. In that case, if you're getting a starting caliber corner, I'd do it yesterday. That's what I'm saying. The value has to be there. The need is so apparent at the cornerback position. If you can get somebody who's, and I'm not talking about obviously a true lockdown corner. I'm not talking about Patrick Peterson or Aqib Talib or Xavier Rhodes, one of those guys. Obviously, you're not getting that. But if you can get a legit second corner in this league, I mean, I think at that point, I put out a number of names. I say Jordan Matthews, Michael Kendricks, even Jason Kelsey. I say, who do you want?
Yeah.
I mean, that's how desperate the need is at that position.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, is with us here. The Eagles finishing up their first full week of full teams. Give us a couple guys that have stood out to you, maybe surprised, that were a little under the radar.
Well, I think the first name that we've talked about all week is Marcus Johnson. He's been great. Right now, he's been, as I said, one of the best three receivers on this team. And you could argue him and Nelson Aguilar, I would argue, have been right there. Obviously, Alshon, even though he's been out of practice, he's head and shoulders above. You put him aside. As far as the other guys, they've been really, really good, both of them. And then I think when the pads came on, I think you saw a lot more from Wendell Smallwood that we had not seen, and that's just the nature of the running back position. When the pads come on and when you hit in live periods, all of a sudden you can break tackles. And maybe if they whistled a play dead because there was sort of a defensive lineman shooting the gap and touching the running back, well, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to bring him down. And that's where Wendell has kind of excelled. So I think he's improved a little bit now that camp has gotten more physical. Defensively, I've been really impressed with Tim Jernigan. Everything you hear about him is true. He's tremendously quick off the ball. He's got a motor that never stops, which is, you kind of speculate him being on the same defensive line as Brandon Graham, who's another player like that, who sort of goes 100 miles an hour, and you could see opposing offenses having real difficulty with that. And we haven't even mentioned Fletcher Cox. He's the best player on that line, and maybe the best player on this team. So those are some of the guys that have stood out. Unfortunately, the one guy who hasn't, that I needed to see more from, and it's probably not fair. I say it's not fair all the time, but it's Rasul Douglas. I was hoping he would kind of seize that starting cornerback job, and to this point, he hasn't even been close.
Yeah. A couple things with John McMullen here. Last night, the Cowboys played. We were talking about Prescott. I find him to be interesting because he's got the 23 touchdowns, 4, and that makes me reminisce back to a Nick Foles number that is very popular and lauded in this area, the 27-2. But do you see Prescott taking a step back? Is he, or you say 23 touchdowns, 4 interceptions? Okay, people are going to have film on him. Does he take a step back, or does he have that he is going to improve? Because in year 2, you hope he improves, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think he is going to take a step back statistically. That doesn't necessarily mean he's taking a step back as a player. There is going to be adjustments to him, though. and that's the way this league works. I often say it's a copycat league. Everybody says that, but I add it's a really slow copycat league, and it moves sort of like trying to turn an ocean liner in the middle of the Atlantic. It happens, but it takes a long time, and it generally takes in the off season. I think you saw down the stretch a number of teams started doing a better job with the Cowboys, and then you'll see other defense coordinators kind of watching that film, picking up on it, and they're going to make things more difficult for them this year. So I said the Cowboys are taking a step back for a number of reasons. They're not a 13-win team. Part of it is you're going to see that kind of market correction with Dak Prescott. Part of it is the defensive talent, which wasn't great to begin with, is even worse, at least on paper. So they're going to come back to the division at least a little bit. They're still the best team in the division, though, because they have such talent offensively. And I think ultimately Dak Prescott's going to be a star. And I often say I was most impressed by him in the playoff loss, even though they lost the game, because Aaron Rodgers was so hot at that time, and the Packers went in there and absolutely blitzed them in the first quarter and a half of that game. It was a knockout blow. Most guys would have given up. And he brought them all the way back. Granted, it was a bad Packers defense, but he wasn't awed by the stage, or he didn't panic, and he played very, very well in the losing effort. I think that's a positive. I think everything about him says he's going to be a star, but that doesn't mean he's not going to have to adapt and sort of adjust to the adjustments being made to him, and I think you're going to see that this year.
John McMullen covers the Eagles for our website, 973ESPN.com. He also covers the league nationally for FanRag Sports NFL. John, give us what you know about Jay Cutler and maybe his short-lived time in the booth, which could include 0 games.
Well, I think there's a very good chance he's going to be the next starting quarterback of the Miami Dolphins. I think it's pretty clear. At least it should be to the Dolphins. I mean, they went through this once. They were trying to go the rest and rehab route with Ryan Tannehill last year. He got hurt in December. They thought 6 weeks he might be ready for the playoffs. He was not. And here we are 8 months later, basically, and he gets hurt again. So at this point, you got to be realistic. You got to fix that thing. You got to have reconstructive knee surgery, and at that point, obviously, the Dolphins are in a position like Minnesota was last year when Teddy Bridgewater went down. They have to do something drastic. Matt Moore's not the answer. Jay Cutler is very familiar with Adam Gase and vice versa. He had one of his best seasons when Adam Gase was the offensive coordinator in Chicago. So the two are very comfortable, and as long as Jay Cutler's a starting quarterback and being paid like a starting quarterback, he'll come back and play.
Yeah, he's not nearly as tied to his new job as Romo is.
No, and it'll be there. And by the way, I think, because of his reputation, ultimately, I think people don't think of Jay Cutler as a TV guy, but he's really smart. He's really good. He's really capable of getting thoughts out clearly. And I think ultimately he's going to be better at TV than Tony Romo. But I think it's going to have to wait because he's going to come back. He's going to play for the Miami Dolphins. At least that's the feeling I get today.
Interesting there. John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. NFC East, we talked about this before you jumped on, John. Do you think the Giants' defense matches last year's unit? I mean, they were pretty darn good last year after being wretched the year before. They made a lot of signings that all kind of hit for them.
Yeah, it's going to be tough because they were great defensively last year. And it was free agency. They rarely do you hit when you sign such high-profile players, but they did with Damian Harrison and Olivier Vernon, Janoris Jenkins. They all hit. They all played very well. Then you had sort of the improvement from within. Jason Pierre-Paul got, farther off the fireworks accident, became more like the player he was before. Landon Collins was probably the most improved defensive player in all of football. Went from a below-average player to an all-pro player, basically. So that was a big part of it. And they carried that team. If you look at them offensively, they were awful. If you look at their numbers, 30th, basically 28th to 32nd in every high-profile offensive category. They couldn't run the football. They have one of the worst offensive lines in football, and that hasn't changed. And they also have a descending quarterback. So that defense has to carry them again, and we'll see if they can do it. They do have a lot of talent, but usually for the same reason I said with the Cowboys on the opposite end and Dak Prescott. People are going to devise ways to sort of attack the defense, and you expect them to be not quite as good as they were last season, but they still have the potential to be very good.
Hey, John, real quick, going back to the Miami situation, would Kaepernick be an option there? Gay's interesting because he was the guy who kind of developed that Tebow offense down there in Denver.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's first on the list, but if you get to a point where if for some reason Jay Cutler says, I do want to stay at Fox and I don't want to come back, then sure, I think you have to visit it, because I don't think you can go through 16 games with Matt Moore. And there's also the trade route people can go. The Vikings did it last year with Bradford. There's already talk of Brock Osweiler being spun off by the Browns and heading down to Miami. So they're going to explore every avenue. I think Colin would be in those avenues, but I think he'd be down on the list, plan C or plan D, not plan A.
Yeah, as we know, yesterday, Eagles safety Malcolm Jenkins calling, teams cowards for not considering Kaepernick there. So it sounds like, there are players out there now that are starting to get their voice heard.
Yeah, and they have the right to their opinion. I think, the problem is with the Kaepernick talk, I think, if you look at the context of each situation, it sort of melts away as far as the belief teams are running away from Colin Kaepernick. I've talked about it before. We don't know what he wants to play for. The talk in Seattle from people I've talked to when he visited there is he wanted to compete as a starter with Russell Wilson. And he certainly wasn't going to get take the contract Austin Davis got. So, it was sort of spun as how could the Seahawks possibly sign Austin Davis instead of Colin Kaepernick? Well, because Kaepernick wouldn't take $890,000, and he thought he should compete with Russell Wilson.
Right.
That had some context to that story. And the same thing with the Jets. And people say, well, yeah, obviously he's better than Josh McCown, and he's better than Christian Hackenberg. But the Jets are trying to tank. They don't want to win 4 or 5 games. Yeah, they want to win 2 or 3 because they want to go get the USC quarterback. So that's the context there. If you look at San Francisco, where he was, and people say Brian Hoyer, he's better than Brian Hoyer. But again, look who the coach is. It's Kyle Shanahan now. If you know anything about Kyle Shanahan's offense, well, Brian Hoyer's a better fit for what he wants to do. And ultimately, he's a bridge to wait for Kirk Cousins. So there's context to all these situations, and I don't blame Malcolm. He doesn't have time. He's worried about the Philadelphia Eagles. He's not going to delve into each personal situation of these teams, but the conspiracy theories sort of melt away when you break each situation down individually.
He's John McMullen at JF McMullen on Twitter, and of course you can read all his Eagles coverage at 97.3 ESPN.com and his NFL national coverage at FanRag Sports NFL. Thanks, pal. Have a good weekend.
Hey, you too. Thanks, Mike.